Darkness came to villages and towns when the sun moved below the horizon. The transition from light to dark happened gradually over a period of time. Activities that required daylight came to an end as visibility decreased. People moved from outdoor spaces to indoor spaces as evening arrived. The change happened at different times depending on the season of the year. Homes in villages were small structures made from available materials. Wood and stone were common building materials in most regions. Roofs were designed to keep out rain and provide shelter. Walls had few openings and those that existed were small. The interiors of these homes became dark when outside light faded. Fire provided the primary source of light after sunset. Wood was burned in hearths or fire pits inside dwellings. The fire also provided warmth during cool evenings and nights. Maintaining fire required attention to ensure it continued burning. Fuel for fire had been gathered during daylight hours. Most people lived in households with multiple family members. The same space was used for cooking and sleeping and other activities. Furniture was minimal and served basic functions. Sleeping areas were often shared among several people. Privacy was limited in these small living spaces. Food preparation for the evening had often begun before darkness arrived. Cooking used fire and took time to complete properly. Meals in the evening were simple and used available ingredients. Eating happened when food was ready rather than at fixed times. The same types of food appeared frequently throughout the year. Work that required seeing details clearly ended when light became insufficient. Some activities could continue in firelight but most required daylight. The evening hours were spent on tasks that did not need bright light. Preparing materials for the next day was common during evening time. Conversation among household members filled some of the evening hours. Animals kept by households were secured before full darkness arrived. Livestock were moved to enclosed spaces or secured areas. This protected them from wandering away or from threats during the night. Checking on animals was part of the evening routine. The animals remained in these locations until morning light returned. Outside the home, the streets and paths became difficult to navigate. Few sources of light existed in outdoor spaces after dark. People who needed to move about carried their own light sources. Most movement outside ended soon after darkness fell completely. The lack of light made outdoor activity impractical for most purposes. Sounds that were not noticed during the day became more apparent at night. The absence of daytime activity made the environment seem quieter. Animals and natural sounds could be heard more clearly. The darkness changed how people experienced their surroundings. Nighttime felt different from daytime in villages and towns. Sleep would eventually come as the evening progressed into full night. The timing of sleep was influenced by when darkness arrived. Earlier sunsets meant earlier sleeping times in winter months. People rose when light returned in the morning. The pattern of sleeping and waking followed the natural cycle of light and darkness. Evening began when the sun moved lower and light started to diminish. People who had been working outdoors began moving toward their dwellings. The transition happened gradually as shadows lengthened across the landscape. Tasks that required good visibility were completed before darkness arrived. Movement from outdoor to indoor spaces followed patterns established through daily repetition. Homes were entered through doorways that could be closed against the night. The doors were made from wood and fitted into openings in walls. Closing the door reduced drafts and provided a sense of enclosure. Inside the dwelling, the air was different from the air outside. Smoke from the fire filled the upper portions of the room. Fire in the hearth had been maintained throughout the day for cooking. As evening arrived, the fire continued to burn and provide light. Additional wood was placed on the fire to keep it burning. The wood had been cut and stored during earlier times for this purpose. The fire's light created shadows that moved on the walls. Preparing the evening meal used the fire that was already burning. Food that had been stored was taken out for preparation. Vegetables and grains were common components of evening meals. Bread that had been baked earlier might be eaten with the meal. Preparation methods were simple and had been used many times before. Cooking vessels were positioned near the fire to receive heat. The vessels were made from clay or metal depending on what was available. Stirring and checking the food happened at intervals during cooking. The smell of cooking food filled the interior space. When the food reached the right consistency, it was removed from direct heat. Eating happened when the food was ready and had cooled slightly. Household members gathered near the fire to eat together. The food was distributed in portions that reflected the size of the household. Eating utensils were simple and might be shared among family members. Conversation during the meal was minimal and focused on practical matters. After eating, the vessels used for cooking and eating were cleaned or wiped. Water for cleaning might have been heated over the fire. The cleaned vessels were placed where they would be ready for the next meal. Scraps from the meal were set aside for animals or discarded. The fire continued to burn and provide light and warmth. Children in the household performed tasks appropriate to their age and ability. Younger children might help with simple cleaning or organizing tasks. Older children assisted with more complex work that needed to be done. Learning happened through watching and participating rather than formal instruction. The same tasks were performed each evening in similar ways. Women in the household often worked on tasks that could be done in firelight. Spinning and mending were activities that filled evening hours. The work was done while sitting near the fire for light and warmth. Materials for these tasks had been prepared during daylight hours. The repetitive nature of the work allowed it to continue in dim light. Thread was spun from fibers that had been processed earlier. The spinning created thread that would be used for weaving or sewing. The motion of spinning was rhythmic and could be sustained for long periods. Completed thread was wound and stored for future use. The same spinning techniques had been used for generations. Mending damaged clothing extended the useful life of garments. Tiers were stitched closed using thread and needles. Worn areas might be reinforced with additional stitching or patches. The work required attention but could be done in the light from the fire. Mended items were returned to use the following day. Men in the household might work on maintaining tools or equipment. Sharpening blades or repairing handles could be done in firelight. The work required touch as much as vision in the dim conditions. Tools needed to be ready for use when daylight returned. Maintenance ensured that tools remained functional over time. Leather items that needed repair were worked on during evening hours. Stitching or reinforcing straps extended their usefulness. The thick material was difficult to work, but repairs prevented the need for replacement. Leather was valuable and items made from it were maintained carefully. The same repair techniques had been passed down through families. Baskets or containers that showed damage were examined and repaired if possible. Weaving new sections to replace damaged ones required skill. The work could be done by touch when light was insufficient. Repaired containers returned to use for carrying or storage. The ability to make and repair these items was common knowledge. Preparations for the next day happened during the evening hours. Materials needed for morning tasks were gathered and positioned conveniently. Checking supplies ensured nothing essential was missing. Planning was minimal and based on repeating the same activities. The next day would follow patterns similar to the current day. Fuel for the morning fire was placed within easy reach. Starting the fire would be the first task when morning came. Having dry wood readily available made the process simpler. The wood had been cut and stored during earlier times specifically for this purpose. Proper storage kept the wood dry and ready to burn. Water that would be needed in the morning was sometimes brought inside. Carrying water in darkness was difficult and potentially dangerous. Having water available inside eliminated the need to fetch it before sunrise. The water was stored in vessels that kept it clean. The same vessels were used repeatedly for this purpose. Animals inside or near the dwelling were checked before people settled for the night. Livestock secured in attached spaces were given final portions of feed or water. Ensuring animals were secure prevented problems during the night hours. The animals would remain in place until morning when they would be released. The routine of checking animals was performed every evening. The fire was adjusted as the evening progressed and bedtime approached. Less wood was added so the fire would burn more slowly. A slowly burning fire provided warmth through the night without constant attention. The fire might be banked with ashes to extend its burning time. Maintaining some fire through the night was preferred when possible. Sleeping areas in the home were simple and used materials that were available. Straw or dried grasses might be used as bedding material. Fabric coverings provided additional warmth when available. The sleeping areas were positioned near the fire for warmth. Multiple family members often shared sleeping spaces. Clothing worn during the day was sometimes kept on for sleeping. Removing clothing would make sleeping colder in homes without much heat. Outer layers might be removed but inner garments remained. Additional coverings were added if available to provide warmth. The same sleeping arrangements were used every night. Darkness outside was complete when clouds covered the moon and stars. Inside the dwelling the fire provided the only light. Shadows moved on the walls as the flames shifted. The quality of light from fire was different from daylight. Shapes and distances were harder to judge in firelight. Sounds in the night were different from sounds during the day. The crackling of the fire was a constant background noise. Movements of animals or other household members could be heard. Outside sounds penetrated the walls occasionally. Wind or rain created sounds that varied with weather conditions. Sleep came gradually as the evening wore on and activity decreased. There was no specific time when sleep was expected to begin. People moved to sleeping areas when they felt tired. The fire continued burning at a low level through the night. Darkness and quiet encouraged the transition to sleep. Night hours passed slowly with little activity inside the dwelling. The fire burned lower as fuel was consumed. Warmth from the fire decreased as the night progressed. People slept through these hours unless awakened by some disturbance. The pattern of sleeping through the night was the normal routine. Morning would eventually arrive with returning light. The fire might still be burning or might have gone out. Starting or reviving the fire would be the first task. The daily cycle would begin again with the same activities. Evening would come again when the sun set. The end of daylight brought changes to activity throughout villages and towns. People completed outdoor work and moved toward their homes. The movement happened at roughly the same time each evening. Paths and streets were walked by people returning from fields or workshops. The familiar routes required little attention to navigate. Dwellings received their occupants as darkness approached. Doors were opened and then closed behind those entering. The interior space was dimmer than the outdoor space had been. Eyes adjusted gradually to the reduced light inside. The smell of smoke and previous cooking filled the air. Hearth fires had been burning and were built up for evening use. Wood was added to increase the flames and provide more light. The fire's warmth became more noticeable as outside temperatures dropped. Positioning near the fire determined how much light and warmth each person received. The fire was the center of evening activity in the home. Food preparation began with gathering ingredients that had been stored. Grains and vegetables formed the basis of most evening meals. Dried or preserved foods were used when fresh food was not available. The same types of meals appeared regularly throughout the year. Preparation methods were simple and required little variation. Pots or vessels were placed over or near the fire for cooking. Heat from the fire slowly warmed the contents of the vessels. Stirring happened periodically to ensure even cooking throughout. The cooking process took time and continued as other activities occurred. When the food was ready, it was removed from the heat. Household members gathered to eat when the meal was prepared. Seating near the fire provided light to see the food. The portions were distributed according to household customs. Eating happened without elaborate rituals or extended time. After eating, the used vessels were set aside for cleaning. Cleaning vessels used water that might need to be heated first. The water was warmed over the fire in a separate container. Warm water made cleaning easier than cold water would. Cleaned vessels were placed in their storage locations. The same locations were used each time for easy retrieval. Evening work began after the meal was finished. Tasks were chosen based on what could be accomplished in firelight. Women often engaged in textile work that continued from earlier times. Spinning or sewing could be done while sitting near the fire. The work proceeded at a steady pace through the evening hours. Fiber prepared during daylight was spun into thread in the evening. The spinning motion was repetitive and required minimal light. Thread accumulated on the spindle as work continued. The completed thread would be used for weaving or repairs. Spinning filled many evening hours throughout the year. Mending clothing that had torn or worn was ongoing work. Each garment was examined to determine what repair was needed. Thread and needles were used to close tears or reinforce weak areas. The repaired items would be worn again the next day. Mending extended the life of clothing that was difficult to replace. Men worked on tools or equipment that needed maintenance. Wooden handles were checked for cracks or weakness. Metal parts were examined and sharpened if they had dulled. The maintenance work ensured tools would function properly when needed. Touch and experience guided much of the work in dim light. Sharpening tools used stones kept for this purpose. The blade was drawn across the stone repeatedly at the correct angle. The motion was repeated until the edge was adequately sharp. Testing the sharpness was done carefully to avoid injury. Sharp tools made work easier and were maintained regularly. Leather goods that showed wear received attention during evening hours. Straps that had stretched were adjusted or replaced. Stitching that had loosened was repaired with new thread. The repairs were made using techniques that had been learned and practiced. Properly maintained leather items lasted for years. Baskets used for carrying and storage sometimes needed repair. Broken sections were rewoven using techniques specific to basket making. New material might need to be added to replace damaged portions. The repair work required knowledge of weaving patterns. Finished repairs restored the basket's functionality. Preparations for morning tasks happened as evening progressed. Items needed at first light were positioned where they could be found. Clothing to be worn was laid out if it differed from current clothing. Tools or equipment for the next day's work were checked. The preparations reduced confusion when morning arrived. Firewood for the morning was placed near the hearth. The wood was arranged so it could be accessed easily in darkness. Having wood ready meant the fire could be started quickly. The morning fire would be needed for warmth and cooking. Adequate wood supply was maintained through careful gathering. Water containers were filled if water was available inside the dwelling. Morning water needs could be met without leaving the home. The containers were positioned where they would not be knocked over. Water stored overnight remained at room temperature. The same containers were used repeatedly for this purpose. Children in the household were given tasks suited to their abilities. Younger children might organize small items or help with simple cleaning. Older children assisted with more complex work like spinning or tool maintenance. Learning happened through participation rather than explanation. Skills developed gradually over years of practice. Stories or conversation might occur during evening work. Family members discussed events of the day or plans for upcoming work. The conversation was practical rather than elaborate. Speaking helped pass the time during repetitive tasks. Long silences were also common as people focused on their work. The fire was tended periodically to maintain adequate light and warmth. Wood was added when the flames began to diminish. The timing of adding wood was learned through experience. Too much wood wasted fuel while too little left the room cold and dark. Proper fire management was an essential skill. Smoke from the fire drifted upward toward openings in the roof. The openings allowed smoke to escape while retaining heat. Some smoke remained in the upper portion of the room. The smell of smoke permeated clothing and furnishings. People became accustomed to the presence of smoke. Outside the dwelling, darkness was complete on nights without moonlight. Stars provided minimal light that did not illuminate the ground. Movement outside required carrying a light source like a torch. Most people remained indoors once darkness had fully arrived. Traveling at night was avoided when possible. Sounds from outside penetrated the walls occasionally. Animals moving or making noises could be heard. Weather sounds like wind or rain were more noticeable at night. Human voices from neighboring dwellings might carry through the darkness. The sounds became familiar through repeated hearing. Inside the dwelling, sounds were mostly from fire and people. The crackling and popping of burning wood was constant. People moving or working created small sounds. Conversation added to the acoustic environment. The overall sound level was low compared to daytime activity. Temperature inside the dwelling dropped as the night progressed. The fire provided warmth but could not heat the entire space. Areas distant from the fire were noticeably cooler. People positioned themselves near the fire for comfort. Additional clothing or coverings were used as needed. Evening activities gradually decreased as bedtime approached. Work that had been ongoing was put aside for the night. Tools and materials were stored in their usual locations. The fire was adjusted to burn more slowly through the night. People began moving toward their sleeping areas. Sleeping spaces were prepared by arranging bedding materials. Straw or other plant materials provided cushioning from the floor. Fabric covers added warmth and comfort when available. The sleeping areas were used every night in the same locations. Arrangements were familiar and required little thought. Outer garments were sometimes removed before sleeping. The removed items were placed where they could be found in the morning. Some clothing remained on to provide warmth during the night. The decision depended on temperature and available coverings. Sleeping arrangements varied little from night to night. Darkness in the dwelling was broken only by the dim glow of the fire. Shapes and shadows were barely visible in the low light. Movement became more cautious without adequate illumination. Eyes adapted to the darkness, but vision remained limited. The fire provided just enough light to navigate the space. Sleep began when people settled into their sleeping areas. No specific time marked when sleeping should start. Tiredness from the day's work made sleep come naturally. The fire continued to burn at a low level. Quiet settled over the dwelling as people slept. Night hours passed with minimal activity or disturbance. The fire gradually consumed its fuel and burned lower. Outside, darkness remained complete until dawn would eventually arrive. People slept through these hours unless awakened by unusual sounds. The pattern repeated every night throughout the year. Morning would bring light and the beginning of another day. The fire would need attention to restart or build up. Daily activities would resume following established patterns. Evening would come again when the sun set. The cycle continued without variation. Sunset marked the transition from work performed in daylight to activities suited for darkness. People who had been in fields or workshops made their way home. The routes they followed were the same routes used daily. Familiarity with the paths made navigation possible even as light diminished. Entry into dwellings happened before full darkness arrived. Doors closed behind people entering their homes. The closing shut out the evening air and outside sounds. Interior spaces were darker than the fading light outside had been. The contrast required a moment for eyes to adjust. Smoke and warmth from the fire became immediately noticeable. Fire burning in the hearth had been maintained or was built up for evening. Wood pieces were added to create flames adequate for light and cooking. The fire had burned in the same location for as long as the dwelling existed. Ashes from previous fires lay beneath the current flames. Heat radiated outward from the fire into the surrounding space. Evening meals were prepared using ingredients kept in storage. Grains formed the foundation of most meals consumed in the evening. Vegetables that had been harvested earlier added variety when available. Preserved foods supplemented fresh items during certain seasons. The meals prepared were similar to meals prepared on previous evenings. Cooking vessels made from clay or metal were positioned for heating. The vessels sat on stones near the fire or hung from hooks above flames. Contents of the vessels heated slowly and required occasional stirring. The process of cooking took time but required only periodic attention. Other activities could occur while food cooked. When cooking was complete, the food was removed from direct heat. The vessel was placed where it would cool to an edible temperature. Household members gathered near the fire for the meal. Distribution of food followed patterns established within each household. Eating proceeded without ceremony or extended duration. Used vessels were cleaned after eating concluded. Water for cleaning might have been warmed over the fire. The cleaning process removed food residue from the vessels. Cleaned items were placed in locations where they were stored. The same storage locations were used consistently for easy access. Work that could be performed in firelight began after the meal. Women in the household often continued textile production that had started during daylight. Spinning transformed prepared fibers into thread using simple tools. The spinning motion was rhythmic and repetitive. Thread accumulated as the evening progressed. Spinning could continue for hours with only the fire providing light. The work required touch and muscle memory more than clear vision. Completed thread was wound onto storage devices. The thread would later be used for weaving or sewing. Spinning was an essential task performed regularly. Sewing repairs to damaged clothing happened during evening hours. Tears in fabric were closed using needle and thread. Worn areas were reinforced with additional stitching. The repairs extended the useful life of garments. Replaced clothing was difficult to produce, so repairs were important. Men worked on maintaining tools and equipment in the evening. Wooden handles were inspected for damage or weakness. Loose joints were tightened or repaired. Metal parts were checked for damage and sharpened if needed. The maintenance ensured tools functioned properly when required. Sharpening dull blades used sharpening stones kept for this purpose. The blade was drawn across the stone at the proper angle. The motion was repeated many times until the edge was restored. A sharp edge made cutting tasks easier and safer. Regular sharpening prevented tools from becoming too dull to use effectively. Leather items such as belts or straps were repaired when damage occurred. Broken stitching was replaced with new thread. Stretched leather was adjusted or trimmed. The repairs used techniques that had been learned through practice. Leather items were valuable and maintained carefully. Baskets showing damage were examined to determine if repair was possible. Broken sections could be rewoven if the damage was limited. New materials might be added to replace portions beyond repair. The repair work used the same techniques as original construction. Repaired baskets continued in service for carrying and storage. Evening preparations included organizing items needed for morning tasks. Materials required at dawn were positioned for easy access. Clothing for the next day was selected and placed conveniently. Tools needed for planned work were checked and prepared. The preparations made morning routines simpler. Fuel for the morning fire was arranged near the hearth. Dry wood was essential for starting fire quickly. The wood was placed close enough to reach easily in darkness. Adequate supply meant the fire could be started without delay. The morning fire was needed for warmth and food preparation. Water brought inside during evening eliminated the need for early morning trips outside. Vessels filled with water were placed in secure locations. The water would be used for cooking and cleaning when morning arrived. Storing water inside was more convenient than fetching it in darkness. The practice was followed whenever possible. Children participated in evening work according to their capabilities. Younger children performed simple tasks like gathering small items. Older children assisted with more complex activities like spinning or repair work. Skills were learned through observation and participation. Progression to more difficult tasks happened gradually over years. Conversation among household members occurred during evening work. The talk focused on daily events or practical matters. Planning for upcoming tasks was discussed when necessary. Long periods of silence were common as people concentrated on their work. Speaking was intermittent rather than continuous. Fire required periodic attention to maintain proper burning. Wood was added when flames decreased below adequate levels. Too much wood wasted fuel and created excessive heat. Too little wood left the space cold and dark. Experience taught the proper balance for managing fire. Smoke from burning wood rose toward openings in the roof structure. The openings were designed to allow smoke to escape. Some smoke remained in the upper portions of the room. The constant presence of smoke affected the smell of clothing and furnishings. Adaptation to smoke was necessary for indoor life. Outside the dwelling, complete darkness arrived as twilight ended. Moonlight provided some illumination on clear nights when the moon was visible. Cloudy nights or dark moon phases meant total darkness outside. Movement outdoors required artificial light sources. Most outdoor activity ceased with darkness. Sounds from outside reached the interior through walls and roof. Animal noises were more noticeable at night without daytime sounds to mask them. Weather created sounds that varied with conditions. Wind moved through trees or around structures. Rain created distinctive sounds when it fell. Inside sounds came from the fire and from people moving or working. Burning wood crackled and popped as sap heated. People made small sounds as they performed tasks. Conversation added intermittent sound. The overall sound level was low. Temperature in the dwelling declined as the night continued. Fire provided warmth but only in the immediate area around it. Distant corners remained cool or cold depending on outside temperature. People stayed near the fire for comfort. Additional clothing or coverings compensated for lower temperatures. Activities decreased as the evening wore on towards sleeping time. Work in progress was set aside until the next day. Materials and tools were stored in their customary locations. The fire was adjusted to burn slowly through the night hours. Movement towards sleeping areas began. Sleeping areas were arranged using materials kept for this purpose. Bedding made from straw or dried plants cushioned the sleeping surface. Coverings made from fabric added warmth. The same sleeping locations were used each night. Arrangement was routine and required minimal effort. Some clothing was removed before sleeping while other garments remained on. Removed items were placed for easy retrieval in the morning. Decisions about clothing depended on temperature and available bedding. Sleeping comfort was balanced against warmth needs. Practices varied little from night to night. Light from the fire dimmed as flames burned lower. Shadows in the room became less distinct. Movement required caution in the reduced light. Vision was limited to shapes without clear detail. The dying fire provided minimal illumination. Sleep came as people settled into their sleeping places. The timing was not fixed but occurred when tiredness overtook activity. Work from the day made sleep come easily. The fire burned quietly in the hearth. Silence settled over the household. Night passed with little happening inside the dwelling. The fire consumed its fuel gradually. Outside remained dark until dawn would eventually arrive. People slept undisturbed unless something unusual occurred. The pattern was the same every night. The fading of daylight brought people from their various work locations toward home. Fields and workshops were left behind as evening approached. Paths leading to dwellings were traveled in the diminishing light. The routes were known well enough to require little attention. People arrived at their homes as darkness gathered. Entry into dwellings occurred through doorways that were then secured. Closing doors kept out the cooler evening air. The interior had been warmed by fire burning throughout the day. Smoke from the fire filled the upper portions of the room. The atmosphere inside was familiar from countless previous evenings. Fire in the hearth was built up for the evening hours ahead. Additional wood was placed on existing flames to increase light and heat. The fire occupied the same space it had occupied since the hearth was built. Accumulated ash beneath the burning wood showed years of use. Warmth from the flames spread into the surrounding area. Preparation of the evening meal began with accessing stored food supplies. Grains stored in containers or sacks provided the main component. Vegetables preserved or stored from earlier harvests added to the meal. The combination of ingredients varied little from day to day. Cooking methods were those that had been used many times before. Vessels for cooking were positioned to receive heat from the fire. Some vessels sat directly on hot stones while others hung from supports. The food inside heated slowly as the fire maintained its temperature. Stirring occurred at intervals to prevent uneven cooking or burning. The cooking process continued while other activities took place. Completion of cooking was followed by serving the prepared food. The food was distributed among household members in usual portions. Eating occurred near the fire where light was adequate to see. The meal was consumed without extended formality or ritual. After eating, the vessels were set aside for cleaning. Cleaning the cooking and eating vessels used heated water when available. Cold water could be used, but warm water was more effective. The vessels were wiped or scrubbed to remove food residue. Once clean, they were returned to their storage places. The locations for storage remained consistent over time. Evening tasks began after the meal concluded. Women often engaged in textile work that could continue in firelight. Spinning fibers into thread was work that filled many evening hours. The spinning tool was operated through repetitive hand motions. Thread accumulated gradually as the work proceeded. The work of spinning required minimal light once the technique was mastered. Touch and rhythm guided the process as much as vision. Completed thread was wound for storage until it would be needed. Thread production was continuous work that never fully ended. The same techniques had been used for generations. Repairing worn or damaged clothing occurred during evening hours. Items needing attention were examined to assess the required work. Needle and thread closed tears in fabric. Reinforcement stitching strengthened areas showing wear. The repairs allowed continued use of items that would otherwise be unwearable. Men in the household worked on tool maintenance and repair. Wooden components were checked for cracks or loose fittings. Joints were tightened or mended when problems were found. Metal parts were inspected and prepared for sharpening. The maintenance kept tools ready for use. Sharpening tools used stones designed for this purpose. The tool edge was drawn across the stone repeatedly. The angle and pressure were controlled through practiced motion. The process continued until the edge was properly sharp. Sharp tools made work more efficient and less tiring. Leather goods requiring repair received attention in the evening. Broken stitches were replaced with new thread. Worn areas were reinforced or patched as needed. The repair techniques were standard methods learned through practice. Leather items lasted longer with regular maintenance. Baskets that had been damaged were examined for repair possibilities. Broken strands could be replaced through reweaving. The work used the same patterns as original construction. Successfully repaired baskets returned to use for their intended purposes. Basket repair was a common skill in most households. Preparations for the following day occurred during the evening. Items needed in the morning were gathered and positioned conveniently. Clothing to be worn was selected and laid out. Tools for planned work were checked for readiness. These preparations simplified the morning routine. Wood for starting the morning fire was placed near the hearth. The wood needed to be dry to catch flame easily. Positioning it nearby meant it could be reached without difficulty in darkness. Sufficient quantity ensured the fire could be started without searching for more. The morning fire was essential for warmth and cooking. Water containers were filled during the evening when possible. Having water inside eliminated the need to fetch it before dawn. The water was stored in vessels that prevented spilling. Water brought in during evening remained available through the night. The practice was routine in households. Children in the household assisted with tasks matching their abilities. Younger children handled simple jobs like organizing or fetching items. Older children took on more complex work as their skills developed. Learning occurred through observation and gradual participation. Advancement to harder tasks happened slowly over time. Talk among family members happened intermittently during evening work. Conversation covered daily events or upcoming tasks. Practical matters were discussed when decisions were needed. Silence was also common as people focused on their work. Extended conversation was not typical during working hours. The fire required periodic feeding to maintain adequate flames. Wood was added when the fire burned down to a certain level. The amount added was judged by experience with fire management. Too much wood created waste while too little left inadequate light and heat. Proper fire tending was an essential household skill. Smoke from the fire moved upward toward roof openings. The openings were positioned to encourage smoke to exit. Some smoke lingered in the upper room space. The smell of smoke permeated all items in the dwelling. People became accustomed to the constant presence of smoke. Outside the dwelling, darkness was complete except when moon or stars provided light. Clear nights with a bright moon offered some visibility. Overcast nights or dark moon phases meant total darkness. Movement outside during darkness was difficult and usually avoided. Artificial light was needed for any necessary outdoor activity. Sounds penetrating from outside became more noticeable at night. Animals made noises that carried through the darkness. Wind created sounds as it moved past structures. Rain falling on the roof produced distinctive rhythmic sounds. These sounds became familiar through nightly repetition. Sounds inside came from fire and from people moving or working. Burning wood made crackling and popping noises. People created small sounds through their movements and activities. Occasional conversation added to the sound environment. Overall, the sound level was low compared to daytime. Temperature inside decreased as the night progressed. The fire warmed only the area immediately around it. Spaces farther from the fire remained cooler. People stayed near the fire for comfort when possible. Additional garments or coverings provided warmth when needed. Evening activities gradually wound down as sleeping time approached. Work that had been ongoing was put away for the night. Tools and materials returned to their storage locations. The fire was banked or reduced for slow burning overnight. People began preparing for sleep. Sleeping areas were readied with bedding materials used each night. Straw or plant materials provided padding beneath sleepers. Fabric coverings added warmth and comfort. The arrangement was the same each night. Little thought was required for the routine task. Clothing choices for sleeping depended on temperature and available bedding. Some outer garments were removed and set aside. Other layers remained on for warmth through the night. The balance between comfort and warmth determined what stayed on. Practices were consistent from night to night. Firelight diminished as flames burned lower. The room became darker with only dim glow remaining. Movement was cautious in the reduced visibility. Shapes could be seen but details were lost. The dying fire marked the approach of sleep time. Sleep began when people settled into their prepared sleeping places. No fixed time determined when sleep should start. Natural tiredness from the day's activity brought sleep. The fire continued burning at a low level. Quiet settled over the dwelling. Night hours passed with minimal activity inside the home. The fire gradually consumed remaining fuel. Outside remained dark until morning light would return. Sleep continued undisturbed unless unusual events occurred. The same pattern repeated every night. Daylight ended and people moved from outdoor work toward their dwellings. The transition from light to darkness happened in stages. Fields and work areas were left behind as visibility decreased. Paths to homes were familiar enough to walk with diminishing light. Arrival at dwellings occurred before complete darkness settled. Doors were closed after people entered their homes. The closing created separation from the outside environment. Interior spaces had been warmed by fires burning during the day. Smoke from the hearth filled parts of the room. The combination of warmth and smoke was familiar to inhabitants. Hearth fires were maintained or increased for evening purposes. Wood was added to create flames suitable for light and cooking. The hearth occupied a central location in the dwelling's main room. Ash from many previous fires lay beneath the current burning wood. Heat spread from the fire into nearby areas. Food for the evening meal was gathered from storage locations. Grains provided the foundation for most meals prepared at this time. Other ingredients were added based on what was available. The types of food used changed little from one evening to another. Preparation followed methods that had been used repeatedly. Cooking vessels were arranged to receive heat from the fire. Clay or metal containers held the food being prepared. Positioning determined how much heat reached each vessel. The cooking process required time and occasional attention. Other tasks could proceed while food cooked. When cooking finished, the food was distributed to household members. Portions were served according to established household patterns. Eating took place near the fire where light allowed food to be seen. The meal was consumed without extended ritual. Used vessels were set aside after eating concluded. Vessel cleaning used water that might be heated over the fire. Warm water made the cleaning process easier. Food residue was removed through scrubbing or wiping. Clean vessels were placed in their designated storage areas. The storage locations were used consistently for convenient retrieval. Work suitable for evening hours began after the meal. Women commonly continued textile production started during daylight. Spinning converted prepared fibers into usable thread. The spinning motion was repetitive and sustained over long periods. Thread collected on the spindle as work continued. Spinning work could proceed with only firelight for illumination. The process relied on touch and practiced motion. Completed thread was wound and set aside for later use. Thread production was ongoing work performed throughout the year. The techniques used were traditional and unchanged. Mending damaged clothing filled evening hours for many women. Torn fabric was repaired using needle and thread. Worn areas received reinforcement through additional stitching. The repairs preserved garments that were difficult to replace. Each mended item could continue in use. Men worked on maintaining tools and equipment during evening hours. Wooden handles were inspected for damage or weakness. Loose connections were tightened or repaired as needed. Metal components were checked and prepared for sharpening. Regular maintenance kept tools functional. Tool sharpening used stones kept specifically for this purpose. The tool edge was moved across the stone in controlled motions. The process continued until the desired sharpness was achieved. Sharp tools performed work more efficiently. The sharpening was performed regularly to maintain tool quality. Leather items needing repair were worked on in the evening. Broken stitching was replaced with new thread. Damaged sections were reinforced or patched. The repair methods were learned through practice and observation. Maintained leather items lasted for extended periods. Damaged baskets were examined to assess repair possibilities. Broken sections could be rewoven using appropriate materials. The weaving followed the same pattern as original construction. Repaired baskets returned to service for their intended uses. Basket repair was common knowledge in households. Evening time included preparations for the next day's activities. Materials needed in the morning were positioned for easy access. Clothing was selected and placed conveniently. Tools required for planned work were checked and readied. Morning preparations made the start of the day simpler. Firewood for morning use was arranged near the hearth. Dry wood caught flame more easily when starting fire. Positioning near the hearth meant the wood could be reached in darkness. Adequate quantity prevented the need to search for more wood. The morning fire was necessary for warmth and cooking. Water was brought inside during evening hours when practical. Interior water storage eliminated early morning trips outside. Containers held water for morning cooking and cleaning needs. The water remained accessible through the night. This practice simplified morning routines. Children participated in evening tasks according to their development. Younger children performed simple jobs requiring minimal skill. Older children assisted with more complex activities. Learning happened through watching and gradual participation. Skill development occurred slowly over years. Conversation among household members occurred during evening work. Talk focused on practical matters and daily events. Planning discussions happened when necessary. Silent periods were common as people concentrated. Extended conversation was not typical during working time. Fire management required periodic attention throughout the evening. Wood was added when flames decreased below useful levels. The amount added was determined by experience. Proper fire management balanced light and heat with fuel conservation. The skill was essential for household function. Smoke from burning wood moved toward roof openings. The openings were designed to allow smoke to escape upward. Some smoke remained in the upper portions of the room. Everything in the dwelling absorbed smoke smell. Inhabitants became accustomed to constant smoke presence. Darkness outside was broken only by natural light sources. Moonlight provided some visibility on clear nights. Cloudy conditions or dark moon phases meant complete darkness. Movement outside was difficult without artificial light. Most outdoor activity ended with darkness. External sounds became more noticeable during nighttime hours. Animals created noises that traveled through the darkness. Wind produced sounds as it moved around structures. Rain created patterns of sound when it fell. These sounds were familiar from nightly occurrence. Interior sounds came from fire and human activity. Burning wood made characteristic crackling sounds. People moving or working created small noises. Occasional speech added to the sound environment. The overall sound level remained relatively low. Interior temperature dropped as the night advanced. Fire warmed only the immediate surrounding area. More distant spaces remained cooler. People positioned themselves near fire for warmth. Additional clothing or coverings provided supplemental warmth. Evening work gradually decreased as sleeping time neared. Ongoing tasks were set aside until the next day. Materials and tools were returned to storage. The fire was adjusted for slower burning overnight. Preparation for sleep began. Sleeping spaces were prepared using bedding materials. Straw or dried plants cushioned the sleeping surface. Fabric covers added warmth when available. The same locations were used each night. The routine required minimal thought or effort. Clothing for sleeping depended on temperature and available bedding. Some outer layers were removed for comfort. Other garments remained on for warmth. The choices balanced comfort with temperature needs. Sleeping clothing varied little from night to night. Firelight decreased as the fire burned down. The room became darker with only dim illumination. Movement required care in the reduced light. Visual detail was lost in darkness. The fading fire indicated approaching sleep. Sleep came as people moved to their sleeping areas. No specific time marked when sleeping should begin. Tiredness from daily work encouraged sleep. The fire continued at a low level. Quiet replaced earlier activity. Night hours passed with little happening in the dwelling. Fire consumed remaining fuel slowly. Outside remained dark until morning. Sleep continued unless disturbances occurred. The pattern was identical each night. Evening arrived as daylight faded from the sky above villages and fields. People who had been working in various locations began returning to their homes. The paths they walked were the same paths used every day. Familiarity with routes made travel possible in diminishing light. Entry into dwellings happened as darkness gathered outside. Doors closed behind people as they entered their living spaces. The closure separated interior from exterior environment. Inside the dwelling, fire had been burning throughout the day. Warmth from the fire had accumulated in the enclosed space. Smoke from burning wood lingered in upper portions of the room. Fire in the hearth was built up for evening use. Wood pieces were added to existing flames. The fire provided light and heat for the hours ahead. Ash beneath the burning wood showed the hearth's continuous use. Heat radiated outward from the flames into surrounding areas. Evening meal preparation began with accessing stored food. Grains formed the basis of most meals prepared at this time. Additional ingredients were added when they were available. The meals prepared were similar to previous evening meals. Cooking methods followed established patterns. Vessels for cooking were positioned to receive heat from fire. Some sat on stones placed in or near the flames. Others hung from hooks or frames above the fire. Food inside the vessels heated gradually. Stirring occurred periodically during the cooking process. Cooked food was served when preparation was complete. Distribution followed patterns established within each household. Eating occurred near the fire where light was adequate. The meal proceeded without elaborate ceremony. After eating, the vessels were collected for cleaning. Cleaning vessels required water that might be warmed first. Warm water was more effective than cold for removing food. The vessels were scrubbed or wiped to remove residue. Clean vessels returned to their designated storage locations. Storage places remained consistent for easy access. Tasks suitable for evening hours began after the meal ended. Women in households often worked on textile production. Spinning transformed prepared fibers into thread through repetitive motion. The work could continue for extended periods. Thread accumulated on spindles as evening progressed. Spinning required less light than many other tasks. The process relied on practiced hand movements and touch. Completed thread was wound for storage. Thread production was continuous throughout seasons. Techniques used had been passed down through generations. Clothing repairs occupied evening time for many women. Damaged garments were examined to determine needed work. Needle and thread closed tears in fabric. Worn areas received reinforcing stitches. Repairs extended the usable life of clothing. Men worked on tool maintenance during evening hours. Wooden parts were inspected for damage or wear. Loose components were tightened or secured. Metal parts were prepared for sharpening. The maintenance ensured tools remained functional. Sharpening dull tools used stones kept for this work. Tool edges were drawn across stone surfaces repeatedly. The angle and pressure were controlled through experience. The work continued until proper sharpness was restored. Regular sharpening maintained tool effectiveness. Leather goods requiring repair received attention. Broken stitches were replaced with new thread. Damaged areas were reinforced or patched. Repair techniques were learned through practice. Well-maintained leather items lasted many years. Baskets showing damage were assessed for repair. Broken strands could be replaced through weaving. The repair work matched original construction patterns. Repaired baskets continued in their usual functions. Basket repair skills were common in households. Preparations for morning activities happened during evening hours. Materials needed at dawn were gathered and positioned. Clothing for the next day was selected. Tools for planned work were checked. These preparations simplified morning routines. Wood for the morning fire was placed near the hearth. Dry wood was necessary for easy fire starting. Convenient positioning allowed access in darkness. Adequate supply prevented delays in starting fire. Morning fire was essential for household function. Water containers were filled during evening when possible. Interior water storage eliminated morning trips outside. The water remained available through the night. Storage vessels prevented spilling or contamination. This practice was routine in most households. Children assisted with tasks appropriate to their abilities. Simple jobs were given to younger children. More complex work was assigned to older children. Learning occurred through observation and participation. Skill progression happened gradually over time. Talk among household members occurred intermittently. Conversation covered daily events and practical matters. Planning happened when necessary. Silent periods were common during focused work. Extended conversation was not typical. Fire required regular attention to maintain proper burning. Wood was added when flames diminished. The amount added was judged by experience. Proper fire management balanced needs with fuel conservation. The skill was necessary for all household members. Smoke rose from the fire toward openings in the roof. The openings were designed to encourage upward smoke movement. Some smoke remained in the room's upper space. The smell of smoke penetrated all household items. Constant smoke presence became normal. Outside darkness was complete without natural light sources. Moonlight on clear nights provided some illumination. Overcast conditions meant total darkness. Movement outside required artificial light. Most people remained indoors after dark. Sounds from outside reached the interior. Animal noises carried through the darkness. Wind created sounds around structures. Rain produced rhythmic patterns when falling. The sounds were familiar from regular occurrence. Interior sounds came from fire and people. Burning wood crackled and popped. Movement and work created small noises. Occasional speech added to the environment. Sound levels remained relatively low. Temperature decreased as evening progressed into night. Fire warmed only nearby areas. Distant spaces remained cool. People stayed near fire for comfort. Additional coverings provided warmth when needed. Evening activities decreased as sleeping time approached. Ongoing work was set aside. Tools and materials returned to storage. Fire was adjusted for overnight burning. Sleeping preparations began. Sleeping areas were prepared with usual bedding. Straw or plant materials provided cushioning. Fabric covers added warmth. The same locations were used nightly. Arrangement was routine and automatic. Sleeping clothing depended on temperature. Some outer garments were removed. Other layers remained for warmth. The balance was determined by conditions. Practices varied little between nights. Fire burned lower as evening ended. Room darkness increased with diminishing flames. Movement became more careful in low light. Visual detail disappeared. Fading fire marked transition to sleep. Sleep began when people settled in sleeping areas. No fixed time determined the start. Natural tiredness encouraged sleep. Fire continued burning slowly. Quiet replaced earlier activity. Night passed with minimal activity. Fire consumed fuel gradually. Outside remained dark. Sleep continued unless disturbed. The pattern repeated every night. Sunset brought the end of daylight work and movement toward homes. People left fields and workshops as visibility decreased. The routes homeward were walked without needing to consider direction. Familiarity made navigation automatic even in fading light. Dwellings were reached before full darkness arrived outside. Entry into homes was followed by closing doors behind inhabitants. The doors shut out evening air and sounds from outside. Interior spaces held warmth from fires burning during the day. Smoke from the hearth filled portions of the room's upper space. The atmosphere was unchanged from previous evenings and familiar to all. Hearth fires were maintained or increased for evening needs. Additional wood was placed on burning flames to build them up. The fire occupied its permanent location in the dwelling's main room. Ash accumulated beneath showed years of continuous use in the same spot. Warmth spread from flames into nearby spaces within the dwelling. Food preparation for evening began with gathering stored supplies from containers. Grains provided the main component of most evening meals prepared. Other foods supplemented the grain when they were available. Meals prepared were similar to those prepared on previous evenings. Methods used followed established patterns that had been learned. Cooking vessels were arranged to receive heat from the fire. Positioning determined the intensity of heat each vessel received. Food inside heated gradually as the fire maintained its temperature. Periodic stirring ensured even cooking throughout the contents. The process continued while other tasks occurred in the household. Prepared food was served when cooking finished and reached completion. Distribution among household members followed usual patterns within the family. Eating happened near the fire where light allowed visibility of food. The meal was consumed without extended ritual or ceremony. Used vessels were collected afterward for the cleaning process. Vessel cleaning used water that might be heated over the fire. Warm water cleaned more effectively than cold water would. Scrubbing removed food residue from the vessel surfaces. Cleaned vessels returned to their designated storage places. Locations for storage remained constant for easy retrieval. Evening work began after the meal concluded and eating ended. Women commonly engaged in textile work that could continue indoors. Spinning created thread from prepared fibers through repetitive motion. The repetitive motion continued through evening hours without stopping. Thread collected on spindles gradually as the work proceeded. Spinning work proceeded with minimal light from the fire. Practiced movements and touch guided the process more than vision. Finished thread was wound onto storage devices for later use. The work continued throughout the year in all seasons. Methods remained unchanged across generations of women. Clothing repairs occupied time during evening hours in the household. Damaged items were assessed for the necessary work required. Tiers were closed with needle and thread carefully. Worn sections received reinforcement through additional stitching. Repairs allowed continued use of garments that would otherwise be unwearable. Men maintained tools and equipment in evening hours after meals. Wooden components were checked for problems or damage. Loose parts were tightened or fixed when found. Metal portions were prepared for sharpening the next day. Maintenance kept tools ready for use when needed. Tool sharpening used stones designed specifically for the purpose. Edges were drawn across stones repeatedly in controlled motions. Control came from practice technique developed over time. Work continued until sharpness was adequate for use. Regular sharpening maintained tool quality and effectiveness. Leather items needing repair received attention during evening time. Stitching was replaced where it had failed or broken. Damaged areas were reinforced with additional material or stitching. Repair methods were learned through practice and observation. Maintained items lasted extended periods with proper care. Damaged baskets were examined for repair possibilities during evening. Broken parts could be rewoven using appropriate techniques. The work followed original construction patterns and methods. Repaired baskets returned to their normal functions. Basket repair was common knowledge among household members. Preparations for the next day occurred during evening hours. Items needed in morning were positioned conveniently for access. Clothing was selected and placed ready for wearing. Tools were checked for readiness and proper condition. Preparation simplified morning routines when daylight returned. Morning firewood was arranged near the hearth for easy access. Dry wood allowed easy fire starting in the morning. Closed positioning meant access in darkness before dawn. Sufficient quantity prevented morning delays in starting fire. Morning fire was necessary for household needs. Water was brought inside during evening when practical to do so. Interior storage eliminated morning trips outside in darkness. Water remained available through the night for morning use. Containers prevented spilling during the night hours. The practice was standard in most households. Children performed tasks matching their abilities and age. Simpler work went to younger children in the household. More complex tasks went to older ones with more skill. Learning happened through participation and observation. Skill development occurred gradually over years. Household conversation occurred during evening work hours. Talk covered daily matters and plans for upcoming days. Discussion happened when needed for coordination. Silence was common during focused work on tasks. Extended talking was infrequent during working time. Fire needed regular feeding to maintain adequate flames. Wood was added at appropriate intervals determined by experience. Amount added came from experience with fire management. Proper management balanced light and heat with fuel use. The skill was essential for household comfort. Smoke from fire moved toward roof openings designed for this. Openings encouraged upward movement of smoke from the room. Some smoke lingered in upper space despite the openings. Smoke smell permeated household items over time. Constant presence became normal to inhabitants. Outside darkness was complete without natural light sources. Clear nights with moon provided some visibility outdoors. Cloudy conditions meant total darkness outside dwellings. Outdoor movement was difficult without artificial light. Most people stayed inside after darkness arrived. External sounds reached the interior at night through walls. Animals made noises in darkness that could be heard. Wind created sounds around buildings and structures. Rain produced patterns when falling on roofs. Sounds were familiar from nightly repetition. Interior sounds came from fire and people inside. Wood burning made crackling and popping noises. Movement created small sounds as people worked. Occasional speech added to the sound environment. Overall sound level remained relatively low. Temperature dropped as night progressed beyond evening. Fire warmed only the immediate area around it. Other spaces stayed cool or cold. People remained near fire for warmth. Additional coverings provided warmth when needed. Evening work decreased as sleeping time neared. Tasks were set aside until the next day. Materials returned to their storage locations. Fire was adjusted for overnight slow burning. Sleep preparations began in the household. Sleeping areas were readied with usual bedding materials. Straw or plants provided padding for sleeping. Fabric added warmth when available. Same locations were used nightly without change. Routine required minimal thought or effort. Sleeping clothing depended on temperature inside. Some garments were removed for comfort. Others remained for warmth through the night. Balance was determined by conditions. Practice varied little from night to night. Fire burned lower toward night's end. Room grew darker with diminishing flames. Movement was cautious in low light. Details disappeared in darkness. Dying fire marked approaching sleep time. Sleep began in prepared sleeping areas. No fixed time determined the start. Tiredness encouraged sleep naturally after work. Fire continued burning slowly. Quiet settled over the dwelling. Night hours passed with little activity inside. Fire consumed fuel gradually through hours. Outside remained dark until morning. Sleep continued undisturbed unless something unusual occurred. Pattern repeated nightly without variation. Evening came as daylight faded from the sky above. People who had been working moved toward their dwellings. The paths they walked were familiar from daily use over years. Navigation required little attention even in diminishing light. Homes were reached as darkness gathered in the surroundings. Doors closed after people entered their living spaces. Closing separated interior from exterior environment. Inside the dwelling, warmth from fire had accumulated during the day. Smoke from burning wood filled upper portions of the room. The environment was familiar from countless previous evenings. Fire in the hearth was built up for evening use. Wood was added to flames already burning in the hearth. The hearth occupied the same location it had always occupied. Ash beneath the fire showed continuous use over time. Heat from flames spread into surrounding areas of the dwelling. Evening meal preparation began with accessing stored food supplies. Grains formed the basis of the meal being prepared. Additional ingredients were added when they were available. The meals were similar to previous meals prepared before. Preparation followed methods that had been used before. Vessels for cooking were positioned near the fire's heat. Heat from flames reached the vessels gradually through placement. Food inside heated as the fire burned steadily. Stirring happened at intervals during the cooking process. The process continued while other activities occurred in the household. Cooked food was distributed when preparation finished completely. Household members received portions according to usual patterns. Eating occurred near the fire where light was present. The meal proceeded without extended ceremony or ritual. Vessels were collected after eating ended for cleaning. Cleaning used water that might be warmed over the fire. Warm water was more effective for cleaning than cold. Food residue was removed from vessel surfaces through scrubbing. Clean vessels returned to their designated storage locations. Storage places remained consistent for convenient access. Work suitable for evening began after the meal concluded. Women worked on textile production that could continue indoors. Spinning created thread from prepared fibers through repetitive motion. The motion was repetitive and continued for hours. Thread accumulated on spindles as work progressed. Spinning required minimal light from the fire's flames. Touch and practiced motion guided the work more than vision. Completed thread was wound onto storage devices for later use. The work continued throughout seasons without interruption. Techniques were unchanged from those used previously. Clothing repairs filled evening time for many women. Damaged garments were examined to assess needed repairs. Tiers were closed with needle and thread carefully. Worn areas received reinforcement through additional stitching. Repairs extended garment life and usefulness. Men worked on tool maintenance during evening hours. Wooden parts were inspected for damage or wear. Loose components were tightened to restore function. Metal parts were prepared for sharpening when needed. Maintenance kept tools functional for daily use. Sharpening used stones kept specifically for this purpose. Tool edges were drawn across stones in controlled motions. Control came from practice technique developed over time. Work continued until edges were sharp enough. Regular sharpening maintained tool effectiveness. Leather items were repaired during evening time. Broken stitching was replaced with new thread. Damaged areas were reinforced with additional material. Repair methods were learned through practice and observation. Maintained items lasted longer with proper care. Baskets showing damage were examined for repair possibilities. Broken sections could be rewoven using appropriate techniques. Work followed original construction patterns and methods. Repaired baskets returned to their normal use. Basket repair was common knowledge among people. Preparations for morning occurred in evening hours. Items needed at dawn were positioned conveniently. Clothing was selected and placed ready for wearing. Tools were checked for readiness and condition. Preparation simplified morning routines when they began. Firewood for morning was arranged near the hearth. Dry wood allowed easy fire starting at dawn. Close positioning enabled access in darkness before sunrise. Sufficient quantity prevented delays in starting morning fire. Morning fire was necessary for household needs. Water was brought inside when possible during evening. Interior storage eliminated morning trips outside in darkness. Water remained available through the night for morning use. Containers prevented spilling during the night hours. The practice was routine in most households. Children assisted with tasks appropriate to their abilities. Simple work went to younger children in the household. Complex tasks went to older ones with more skill. Learning happened through participation and observation. Skills developed gradually over years of practice. Conversation occurred during evening work among household members. Talk covered daily matters and practical concerns. Discussion happened when needed for coordination. Silence was common during focused work on tasks. Extended conversation was infrequent during working time. Fire required regular attention to maintain adequate burning. Wood was added at intervals determined by observation. Amount added came from experience with fire management. Proper management balanced light and heat with fuel conservation. The skill was essential for household comfort. Smoke moved toward roof openings designed for ventilation. Openings encouraged upward movement of smoke from room. Some smoke lingered in upper space despite openings. Smoke smell permeated household items over time. Presence became normal to all inhabitants. Outside darkness was complete without natural light sources. Moonlight provided some visibility outdoors on clear nights. Cloudy conditions meant total darkness outside dwellings. Movement outside was difficult without artificial light sources. People stayed indoors after darkness arrived. Sounds from outside reached the interior through walls. Animals made noises in darkness that could be heard. Wind created sounds around buildings and structures. Rain produced patterns when falling on roofs. Sounds were familiar from nightly repetition. Interior sounds came from fire and people inside. Burning wood made crackling and popping noises. Movement created small sounds as people worked. Occasional speech added to the sound environment. Sound level remained relatively low overall. Temperature dropped as night progressed beyond evening. Fire warmed only the immediate area around it. Other spaces stayed cool or cold depending on outside temperature. People remained near fire for warmth and comfort. Additional coverings provided warmth when needed. Evening work decreased as sleeping time neared. Tasks were set aside until the next day. Materials returned to their storage locations. Fire was adjusted for overnight slow burning. Sleep preparations began in the household. Sleeping areas were readied with usual bedding materials. Straw or plants provided padding for sleeping surfaces. Fabric added warmth when it was available. Same locations were used nightly without change. Routine required minimal thought or effort. Sleeping clothing depended on temperature inside dwelling. Some garments were removed for sleeping comfort. Others remained for warmth through the night. Balance was determined by prevailing conditions. Practice varied little from night to night. Fire burned lower toward night's end. Room grew darker with diminishing flames. Movement was cautious in the low light. Details disappeared in increasing darkness. Dying fire marked approaching sleep time. Sleep began in prepared sleeping areas. No fixed time determined the start of sleep. Tiredness encouraged sleep naturally after days' work. Fire continued burning slowly through the night. Quiet settled over the dwelling. Night hours passed with little activity inside. Fire consumed fuel gradually through the hours. Outside remained dark until morning would arrive. Sleep continued undisturbed unless something unusual occurred. Pattern repeated nightly without variation. Morning would bring light again to the dwelling. Fire would need attention to restart or build up. Daily activities would resume following established patterns. Evening would come again when the sun set. The cycle continued day after day. Water would be collected from the usual source. Meals would be prepared using familiar methods. Work would be performed in customary ways. Animals would be tended according to routine. The routine persisted without change. Fields would be worked when seasons required it. Tools would be used for their designated purposes. Materials would be processed following traditional methods. Items would be repaired when damage occurred. The pattern remained stable. Daylight would allow outdoor work to proceed. Evening would bring return to dwellings again. Fire would be maintained through the evening. Food would be prepared for eating. The sequence repeated daily. Darkness would arrive each evening predictably. Fire would provide light inside dwellings. Work would continue indoors after dark. Sleep would eventually come to all. The cycle was constant and unchanging. Daylight ended and people moved from work areas toward dwellings. The movement happened as visibility decreased with fading light. Paths to homes were walked without needing conscious navigation. Familiarity with routes made travel automatic in dimming conditions. Arrival at dwellings occurred before complete darkness settled. Doors were closed after entry into living spaces. The closure separated interior from exterior conditions. Inside the dwelling, fire had warmed the space during the day. Smoke from the hearth lingered in upper portions. The atmosphere was unchanged from previous evenings. Fire in the hearth was maintained or increased for evening. Wood was added to flames that had been burning. The hearth location was permanent within the dwelling. Accumulated ash showed the fire's continuous use. Heat spread from the flames into nearby areas. Food for the evening meal was gathered from storage. Grains provided the main component of the meal. Other ingredients supplemented when they were available. Meals prepared were similar to those made before. Methods used followed established patterns. Cooking vessels were arranged to receive heat. Positioning determined how much heat reached each vessel. Food inside heated as fire maintained its temperature. Stirring occurred periodically during the cooking. The process continued alongside other household activities. Distribution of cooked food happened when preparation finished. Portions were given according to household patterns. Eating took place near the fire's light. The meal proceeded without elaborate ritual. Vessels were collected afterward for cleaning. Cleaning vessels used water that might be heated. Warm water cleaned more effectively than cold. Residue was removed through scrubbing or wiping. Clean vessels returned to storage locations. Storage places remained the same. Evening work began when the meal concluded. Women engaged in textile work. Spinning created thread from prepared fibers. The repetitive motion continued through the evening. Thread collected on spindles gradually. Spinning work required minimal light. Practiced movements guided the process. Completed thread was wound for storage. Work continued throughout the year. Methods remained unchanged. Repairing clothing occupied evening time. Damaged items were assessed for needed work. Tiers were stitched closed. Worn sections received reinforcement. Repairs allowed continued use. Men maintained tools during evening. Wooden components were inspected. Loose parts were tightened. Metal parts were prepared for sharpening. Maintenance kept tools ready. Sharpening used stones designed for the task. Edges were drawn across stone surfaces. Control came from practiced technique. Work continued until sharpness was adequate. Regular sharpening maintained quality. Leather items received repair attention. Broken stitching was replaced. Damaged areas were reinforced. Repair techniques were learned through practice. Items lasted longer with maintenance. Damaged baskets were examined. Broken sections could be rewoven. Work matched original construction. Repaired baskets returned to use. Repair knowledge was common. Preparations for morning happened in evening. Needed items were positioned conveniently. Clothing was selected and readied. Tools were checked. Preparations simplified morning. Morning firewood was placed near the hearth. Dry wood enabled easy starting. Clothes placement allowed access in darkness. Adequate supply prevented delays. Morning fire was essential. Water was brought inside when practical. Interior storage eliminated morning trips outside. Water remained available overnight. Containers prevented spilling. The practice was standard. Children performed tasks suited to their abilities. Simple tasks went to younger children. Complex work went to older ones. Learning happened through participation. Skills developed over time. Conversation occurred during work. Talk covered practical matters. Discussion happened when necessary. Silence was common during work. Extended talking was rare. Fire needed regular feeding. Wood was added at intervals. Amount came from experience. Management balanced needs with conservation. The skill was necessary. Smoke moved toward roof openings. Openings encouraged upward flow. Some smoke remained in upper space. Smell permeated household items. Presence was normal. Outside was completely dark without natural light. Moonlight gave some visibility on clear nights. Clouds meant total darkness. Movement outside was difficult. People remained indoors. External sounds reached the interior. Animals made noises. Wind created sounds. Rain produced patterns. Sounds were familiar. Interior sounds came from fire and people. Wood crackled and popped. Movement made small sounds. Speech added to the environment. Sound levels were low. Temperature declined as night progressed. Fire warmed only nearby areas. Other spaces remained cool. People stayed near fire. Coverings provided additional warmth. Evening work decreased near sleeping time. Tasks were set aside. Materials returned to storage. Fire was adjusted for overnight. Sleeping preparations began. Sleeping areas were prepared with bedding. Straw provided cushioning. Fabric added warmth. Same locations were used nightly. Routine required little thought. Sleeping clothing depended on temperature. Some garments were removed. Others stayed on for warmth. Balance depended on conditions. Practices varied minimally. Fire burned lower as evening ended. Room darkness increased. Movement became cautious. Details disappeared. Fading fire indicated sleep time. Sleep began in sleeping areas. No fixed time marked the start. Tiredness brought sleep naturally. Fire continued burning slowly. Quiet replaced activity. Night passed with minimal activity. Fire consumed remaining fuel. Outside stayed dark. Sleep continued undisturbed. The pattern repeated nightly. Morning would return with light. Fire would need tending. Activities would resume. Evening would come again. The cycle persisted. Daily tasks would be performed. Water would be collected. Food would be prepared. Work would continue. Routines remained constant. Patterns established long ago continued. Methods stayed unchanged. Skills passed between generations. Knowledge was preserved. Stability persisted. Seasons changed in their cycles. Weather varied with time. Temperatures rose and fell. Conditions changed gradually. Underlying patterns remained. Each household followed similar routines. Variations between families were minor. The overall structure was shared. Communities functioned through repetition. Predictability provided order. Years passed in succession. Generations replaced previous ones. Methods transferred to new people. Patterns persisted through time. Change was minimal. Evenings came with regularity. Darkness followed daylight. Fire provided light inside. Sleep arrived eventually. Mornings brought renewal. The cycle had existed before. It would continue forward. No clear endpoint existed. The pattern was established. It persisted indefinitely. Work happened in familiar ways. Tools served their purposes. Materials were processed. Items were maintained. Functions continued. Life followed predictable sequences. Days progressed in order. Seasons cycled repeatedly. Years accumulated. The pattern endured. Dwellings served their purposes. Fires burned in hearths. Meals were prepared regularly. Sleep occurred nightly. Functions remained constant. People performed expected tasks. Skills were applied daily. Knowledge guided actions. Experience informed decisions. Routines provided structure. Time moved forward continuously. Moments became hours. Hours became days. Days became seasons. Seasons became years. The pattern continued without interruption. Each day resembled previous days. Each evening followed the same structure. Each night brought similar rest. Repetition was constant. Activities filled daylight hours. Evening brought indoor work. Night brought sleep. Morning brought renewal. The cycle was unending. No single day differed significantly. Variations were minor adjustments. The core pattern remained stable. Routines persisted unchanged. Continuity was maintained. Evening arrived as light faded from the sky above. People moved from work locations toward their homes. The paths walked were familiar from repeated use over time. Navigation happened without conscious thought or attention. Dwellings were reached as darkness approached the area. Doors closed after people entered their living spaces. Closing separated inside from outside environment completely. Interior spaces held warmth from fire burning during the day. Smoke from burning wood filled upper areas of the room. The environment was familiar from previous evenings. Fire in the hearth was tended for evening use. Wood was added to existing flames already burning. The hearth occupied its permanent location in the dwelling. Ash beneath showed continuous use over many years. Heat spread from the fire into surrounding spaces. Food was gathered from storage for the evening meal. Grains formed the meal's foundation as they usually did. Other foods were added when they were available. Meals were similar to previous ones prepared before. Methods followed established patterns learned earlier. Cooking vessels were positioned near fire to receive heat. Heat reached vessels through proximity to the flames. Food inside heated gradually as fire maintained temperature. Stirring occurred during the cooking at regular intervals. The process continued while other activities took place. Food was distributed when cooking finished completely. Portions followed household patterns established over time. Eating happened near the fire where light existed. The meal proceeded simply without elaborate ceremony. Vessels were collected afterward for the cleaning process. Cleaning used water that might be warmed first. Warm water cleaned effectively, removing food residue. Residue was removed through scrubbing or wiping. Vessels returned to their storage locations afterward. Storage locations stayed constant for easy access. Evening work began after eating concluded. Women worked on textile tasks that could continue indoors. Spinning created thread from fibers already prepared. Motion was repetitive and sustained over hours. Thread accumulated on spindles as work progressed. Spinning required minimal light from the fire. Movement was practiced and guided by touch. Thread was wound onto storage devices. Work continued through seasons without interruption. Methods stayed unchanged from earlier times. Clothing repairs filled time during the evening. Items were assessed for the work needed. Tiers were stitched closed carefully. Areas were reinforced with additional stitching. Repairs extended the use of garments. Men maintained tools during evening hours. Parts were inspected for damage or wear. Loose components were tightened to restore function. Metal was prepared for sharpening when needed. Tools stayed functional through regular maintenance. Sharpening used stones kept for this purpose. Edges were drawn across surfaces in controlled motion. Technique was practiced and learned over time. Sharpness was restored through repeated motion. Quality was maintained through regular attention. Leather items were repaired when damage occurred. Stitching was replaced where it had broken. Areas were reinforced with additional material. Techniques were known through practice. Items lasted longer with proper maintenance. Baskets were examined when damage appeared. Sections were rewoven using appropriate materials. Construction was matched to original patterns. Baskets returned to their normal use. Knowledge of repair was common. Morning preparations occurred during evening time. Items were positioned for convenient access. Clothing was readied for wearing the next day. Tools were checked for proper condition. Morning routines were simplified through preparation. Firewood was placed nearby the hearth. Wood enabled easy fire starting. Placement allowed access in darkness. Supply prevented delays in starting morning fire. Fire was necessary for household function. Water was brought inside when practical. Storage eliminated trips outside in darkness. Water stayed available through the night. Containers prevented spilling during the hours. Practice was routine in households. Children performed tasks suited to abilities. Simple work went to younger ones. Complex tasks to older children. Learning happened through observation and participation. Skills developed gradually over years. Conversation occurred during work time. Talk covered practical matters and daily events. Discussion happened when coordination was needed. Silence was common during focused work. Talking was limited during tasks. Fire needed feeding to maintain burning. Wood was added at intervals. Amount came from experience with fire. Balance was maintained between light and fuel. Skill was essential for household comfort. Smoke moved upward toward openings. Openings encouraged upward flow of smoke. Some remained in the upper space. Smell permeated items in the dwelling. Presence was normal to inhabitants. Outside was dark without natural light. Moonlight gave visibility on some nights. Clouds meant complete darkness outside. Movement was difficult without light. People stayed inside after dark. Sounds reached interior from outside. Animals made noises in darkness. Wind created sounds around structures. Rain produced patterns on roofs. Sounds were familiar from repetition. Interior sounds came from fire and people. Wood crackled and popped. Movement made small sounds. Speech occurred occasionally. Levels were relatively low. Temperature dropped as night progressed. Fire warmed nearby areas only. Other spaces stayed cool or cold. People remained near fire for warmth. Coverings added additional warmth. Work decreased near sleeping time. Tasks were set aside for next day. Materials were stored in usual places. Fire was adjusted for overnight burning. Preparations for sleep began. Sleeping areas were prepared with bedding. Straw provided padding for sleeping. Fabric added warmth when available. Locations were consistent each night. Routine was automatic and required little thought. Clothing depended on temperature inside. Some was removed for comfort. Some remained for warmth overnight. Balance was maintained based on conditions. Practice varied little between nights. Fire burned lower as evening ended. Darkness increased in the room. Movement was careful in low light. Details faded from view. Fire indicated approaching sleep time. Sleep began in prepared areas. No fixed time existed for starting. Tiredness brought sleep naturally. Fire burned slowly through night. Quiet settled over the dwelling. Night passed with minimal activity. Fire consumed fuel gradually. Outside stayed dark until morning. Sleep continued unless disturbed. Pattern repeated every night. Morning would return with light. Fire would need attention to restart. Activities would resume following patterns. Evening would come again. Cycle continued day after day. Tasks would be performed as before. Water would be collected. Food would be prepared. Work would be done. Routines continued unchanged. Patterns persisted across time. Methods stayed the same. Skills transferred between generations. Knowledge was preserved. Stability remained constant. Seasons cycled through the year. Weather varied with seasons. Temperatures changed gradually. Conditions shifted over time. Underlying patterns remained. Households followed similar routines. Variations were small between families. Structure was shared across community. Communities functioned through repetition. Predictability existed in daily life. Years passed in succession. Generations replaced previous ones. Methods transferred to new people. Patterns persisted through time. Change was minimal across years. Evenings came with regularity. Darkness followed daylight predictably. Fire provided illumination inside. Sleep arrived eventually each night. Mornings brought renewal of cycle. The cycle existed before current generation. It continued forward through time. No endpoint appeared in sight. Pattern was firmly established. Persistence was constant and unbroken. Work happened in familiar ways. Tools served their designated purposes. Materials were processed using known methods. Items were maintained through regular care. Functions continued without interruption. Life followed predictable sequences. Days progressed in expected order. Seasons cycled repeatedly through years. Years accumulated over time. Pattern endured across generations. Dwellings served their intended purposes. Fires burned in constructed hearths. Meals were prepared regularly. Sleep occurred nightly in designated areas. Functions remained constant over time. People performed expected tasks daily. Skills were applied to work. Knowledge guided actions taken. Experience informed decisions made. Routines provided structure to life. Time moved forward continuously. Moments became hours gradually. Hours became days naturally. Days became seasons eventually. Seasons became years over time. Pattern continued without interruption. Days resembled previous days closely. Evenings followed established structure. Nights brought similar rest. Repetition was constant feature. Activities filled daylight hours. Evening brought indoor work. Night brought sleep to all. Morning brought renewal again. Cycle was unending in nature. Days were similar to each other. Variations were minor adjustments. Core pattern remained stable. Routines persisted unchanged. Continuity was maintained always. Evening transitioned to night smoothly. Night transitioned to morning eventually. Morning transitioned to day predictably. Day transitioned to evening again. The sequence repeated endlessly. Fire was central to evening. Light came from burning flames. Warmth came from fire burning. Cooking used the heat. Fire was essential for life. Darkness defined nighttime hours. Light was absent outside dwellings. Interior had firelight only. Movement was limited by darkness. Sleep was primary nighttime activity. Routine structured passing time. Tasks filled available hours. Work occupied people during day. Rest followed work naturally. Pattern organized daily life. Evening came as daylight diminished across the landscape. People moved toward their dwellings from various work areas. Paths were walked without requiring attention to direction or navigation. Familiarity made the movement automatic in fading light conditions. Homes were reached as darkness gathered in the surroundings. Doors were closed after entry into the dwelling. Interior was separated from exterior by the closing. Warmth from fire had filled the space during the day. Smoke lingered in upper portions of the room. The atmosphere was unchanged from previous evenings. Fire was tended for evening use and needs. Wood was added to flames already burning. The hearth occupied its usual place in the dwelling. Ash beneath showed continuous use over time. Heat spread from burning wood into the space. Food was gathered for the evening meal preparation. Grains formed the foundation of the meal. Other items were added when they were available. Meals were similar to those prepared before. Methods were established through repeated use. Vessels were positioned near fire to receive heat. Heat reached them gradually through their placement. Food inside warmed as fire maintained temperature. Stirring occurred periodically during the cooking process. The process continued while other activities occurred. Food was distributed after cooking was completed. Portions followed established household patterns. Eating happened near fire where light existed. The meal proceeded without extended ritual. Vessels were collected for cleaning afterward. Cleaning used water that had been warmed. Residue was removed through scrubbing. Vessels returned to their storage locations. Locations stayed constant for convenience. Access was maintained through organization. Evening work began after the meal. Women worked on textile production. Spinning created thread from prepared fibers. Motion was repetitive and sustained. Thread accumulated on the spindles. Spinning used minimal light from fire. Movement was practiced and automatic. Thread was wound onto storage devices. Work continued through the seasons. Methods stayed the same as before. Clothing was repaired during evening hours. Items were assessed for needed work. Tiers were stitched closed carefully. Areas were reinforced with stitching. Use was extended through repairs. Men maintained tools during the evening. Parts were inspected for damage. Components were tightened when loose. Metal was prepared for sharpening. Tools stayed functional through maintenance. Sharpening used stones kept for purpose. Edges were drawn across stone surfaces. Technique was practiced over time. Sharpness was restored through motion. Quality was maintained regularly. Leather was repaired when needed. Stitching was replaced where broken. Areas were reinforced with material. Techniques were known through practice. Items lasted longer with care. Baskets were examined for damage. Sections were rewoven when broken. Patterns were matched to original. Baskets returned to their use. Knowledge was common among people. Morning preparations occurred during evening. Items were positioned for access. Clothing was readied for wearing. Tools were checked for condition. Morning routines were simplified. Firewood was placed near the hearth. Wood enabled easy fire starting. Placement allowed access in darkness. Supply prevented delays in morning. Fire was necessary for function. Water was brought inside when practical. Storage eliminated trips outside later. Water stayed available through night. Containers prevented spilling overnight. Practice was routine in households. Children performed tasks suited to abilities. Simple work went to younger children. Complex tasks went to older ones. Learning happened through participation. Skills developed over years gradually. Conversation occurred during work time. Talk covered practical matters encountered. Discussion happened when needed. Silence was common during work. Talking was limited during tasks. Fire needed feeding to maintain burning. Wood was added at regular intervals. Amount came from experience gained. Balance was maintained between needs. Skill was essential for comfort. Smoke moved upward toward openings. Openings encouraged upward flow pattern. Some smoke remained in upper space. Smell permeated items in dwelling. Presence was normal to inhabitants. Outside was dark without natural light. Moonlight provided visibility on some nights. Clouds meant complete darkness outside. Movement was difficult without light sources. People stayed inside after darkness. Sounds reached interior from outside areas. Animals made noises in the darkness. Wind created sounds around structures. Rain produced patterns on roof surfaces. Sounds were familiar from repetition. Interior sounds came from fire and people. Wood crackled and popped regularly. Movement made small sounds audible. Speech occurred occasionally among people. Levels were relatively low overall. Temperature dropped as night progressed forward. Fire warmed nearby areas only. Other spaces stayed cool or cold. People remained near fire for warmth. Coverings added additional warmth needed. Work decreased near sleeping time approach. Tasks were set aside for next day. Materials were stored in usual places. Fire was adjusted for overnight burning. Preparations for sleep began gradually. Sleeping areas were prepared with bedding materials. Straw provided padding for sleeping surfaces. Fabric added warmth when it was available. Locations were consistent each night without change. Routine was automatic and required little thought. Clothing depended on temperature inside dwelling. Some was removed for sleeping comfort. Some remained for warmth through night. Balance was maintained based on conditions. Practice varied little between nights consistently. Fire burned lower as evening ended. Darkness increased in the room gradually. Movement was careful in low light. Details faded from view completely. Fire indicated approaching S. Leap time clearly. Sleep began in prepared sleeping areas. No fixed time existed for starting. Tiredness brought sleep naturally after work. Fire burned slowly through night hours. Quiet settled over the dwelling completely. Night passed with minimal activity inside. Fire consumed fuel gradually over hours. Outside stayed dark until morning arrived. Sleep continued unless something disturbed it. Pattern repeated every night consistently. Morning would return with light again. Fire would need attention to restart. Activities would resume following established patterns. Evening would come again after day. Cycle continued day after day endlessly. Tasks would be performed as before. Water would be collected from source. Food would be prepared using methods. Work would be done as usual. Routines continued unchanged over time. Patterns persisted across time periods. Methods stayed the same always. Skills transferred between generations smoothly. Knowledge was preserved through teaching. Stability remained constant through years. Seasons cycled through the year predictably. Weather varied with changing seasons. Temperatures changed gradually over time. Conditions shifted with seasonal patterns. Underlying patterns remained constant always. Households followed similar routines daily. Variations were small between families. Structure was shared across community. Communities functioned through repetition. Predictability existed in daily life. Years passed in succession continuously. Generations replaced previous ones gradually. Methods transferred to new people. Patterns persisted through passing time. Change was minimal across years. Evenings came with regularity daily. Darkness followed daylight predictably always. Fire provided illumination inside dwellings. Sleep arrived eventually each night. Mornings brought renewal of cycle. The cycle existed before current times. It continued forward through time. No endpoint appeared in sight. Pattern was firmly established long ago. Persistence was constant and unbroken. Work happened in familiar ways. Tools served their designated purposes. Materials were processed using methods. Items were maintained through care. Functions continued without interruption. Life followed predictable sequences daily. Days progressed in expected order. Seasons cycled repeatedly through years. Years accumulated over long time. Pattern endured across multiple generations. Dwellings served their intended purposes. Fires burned in constructed hearths. Meals were prepared regularly daily. Sleep occurred nightly in areas. Functions remained constant over time. People performed expected tasks daily. Skills were applied to work. Knowledge guided actions taken always. Experience informed decisions made. Routines provided structure to life. Time moved forward continuously always. Moments became hours gradually naturally. Hours became days without notice. Days became seasons eventually over time. Seasons became years through passage. Pattern continued without interruption ever. Days resembled previous days closely. Evenings followed established structure always. Nights brought similar rest nightly. Repetition was constant feature always. Activities filled daylight hours completely. Evening brought indoor work regularly. Night brought sleep to all. Morning brought renewal again daily. Cycle was unending in nature. Days were similar to each other. Variations were minor adjustments only. Core pattern remained stable always. Routines persisted unchanged through time. Continuity was maintained always consistently. Evening transitioned to night smoothly. Night transitioned to morning eventually. Morning transitioned to day predictably. Day transitioned to evening again. The sequence repeated endlessly always. Fire was central to evening. Light came from burning flames. Warmth came from fire burning. Heat was used for cooking. Fire was essential for life. Darkness defined nighttime hours completely. Light was absent outside dwellings. Interior had firelight only available. Movement was limited by darkness. Sleep was primary nighttime activity. Routines structured passing time effectively. Tasks filled available hours daily. Work occupied people during day. Rest followed work naturally always. Pattern organized daily life completely. Evening arrived with the fading of daylight. People moved from their work areas toward dwellings. The paths they walked were familiar from daily repetition. Navigation required no conscious attention or thought. Homes were reached before complete darkness arrived. Doors closed after people entered the interior space. The closing separated the inside from the outside. Warmth had accumulated from fire burning during day. Smoke from the hearth remained in upper areas. The environment matched previous evenings exactly. Fire in the hearth received attention for evening. Wood was placed on the flames already present. The hearth location was permanent in the dwelling. Ash beneath the fire showed long use. Heat radiated outward from the burning wood. Food for the meal was accessed from storage. Grains provided the base of the meal. Additional items were included when they existed. The meals resembled those made on other evenings. Preparation methods were the same as before. Cooking vessels were arranged to receive fire's heat. Heat transfer occurred through the vessel's proximity. Food inside warmed as the fire burned. Stirring happened at regular intervals during cooking. The cooking continued as other work occurred. Distribution of food happened when cooking concluded. Portions were allocated according to household customs. Eating took place near the fire's light. The meal proceeded in the usual manner. Vessels were gathered for cleaning when eating ended. Cleaning the vessels used water sometimes warmed. Warm water removed food residue more easily. Scrubbing or wiping cleaned the surfaces. Clean vessels went back to storage locations. The storage places did not change. Work for the evening began after eating. Women engaged in textile work indoors. Spinning converted fibers into usable thread. The repetitive motion continued for extended time. Thread collected gradually on the spindles. Spinning work needed little light to perform. Practiced hand movements guided the process. Completed thread was wound for later use. The work happened throughout the year. Techniques remained as they had been. Repairing clothing occupied evening time. Damaged items were examined for repair needs. Needle and thread closed the tiers. Worn sections received additional stitching. Repairs allowed garments to continue in use. Men performed tool maintenance during evening. Wooden parts were checked for problems. Loose fittings were tightened to secure them. Metal parts were readied for sharpening. Tools remained functional through this maintenance. Sharpening tools used stones for the purpose. Tool edges moved across the stone surfaces. Practice technique controlled the motion. The work continued until edges were sharp. Regular sharpening kept tools effective. Leather items received repair when needed. Failed stitching was replaced with new thread. Damaged sections were reinforced or patched. The repair methods were learned skills. Maintained leather items lasted many years. Baskets with damage were examined for repair. Broken weaving could be redone in sections. The repair matched the original construction pattern. Repaired baskets went back into service. Knowledge of basket repair was widespread. Preparing for morning happened during evening hours. Items needed at dawn were positioned nearby. Clothing for the next day was selected. Tools for planned work were checked. These preparations made morning simpler. Wood for the morning fire was placed near the hearth. Dry wood made starting the fire easier. The placement allowed reaching it in darkness. Adequate supply prevented morning delays. The morning fire was essential. Water brought inside eliminated morning trips outdoors. The water was stored in suitable containers. It remained available through the night hours. The containers prevented water from spilling. This practice was standard. Children did work matching their current abilities. Younger children handled simpler tasks. Older children took on more complex work. Learning occurred through doing the tasks. Skill improvement happened slowly over time. Conversation among household members occurred. The talk addressed practical daily matters. Discussion took place when coordination was needed. Silence was common during concentrated work. Extended conversation was not typical. The fire needed wood added periodically. Wood was placed on flames at intervals. The amount added was judged by experience. Maintaining proper fire required learned skill. The balance served multiple purposes. Smoke from the fire rose toward openings. The roof openings were designed for this. Some smoke stayed in the upper space. The smoke smell was absorbed by everything. Constant smoke presence was normal. Outside was dark without light sources. Some nights had moonlight for visibility. Overcast nights had complete darkness. Moving outside was difficult without light. Most people remained indoors. Outside sounds carried to the interior. Animals created noises in the darkness. Wind made sounds around the structure. Rain created distinct patterns when falling. These sounds were familiar and expected. Inside sounds came from fire and people. The burning wood made crackling sounds. People moving created small noises. Occasional talking added to the sounds. The overall sound level stayed low. Interior temperature decreased with night's progression. The fire warmed only nearby areas. Spaces away from fire stayed cool. People positioned themselves near the fire. Additional coverings provided extra warmth. Evening work wound down near sleeping time. Ongoing tasks were put aside temporarily. Materials and tools went to storage. The fire was adjusted for slow overnight burning. Preparations for sleeping began. Sleeping areas were arranged with bedding. Straw or similar materials cushioned the surface. Fabric coverings added warmth when available. The same sleeping locations were used nightly. The arrangement was routine and automatic. Clothing for sleeping depended on temperature. Some outer garments were removed. Other layers stayed on for warmth. The decision balanced comfort and temperature. Sleeping clothing practices were consistent. The fire burned down as evening ended. Darkness in the room increased with this. Movement became more cautious in dimness. Visual details became impossible to see. The declining fire marked sleep approaching. Sleep began when people settled into place. No particular time marked when sleep started. Tiredness from work brought sleep naturally. The fire continued burning at low level. Quiet replaced the earlier activity. Night hours passed with little happening. The fire consumed its fuel slowly. Outside remained dark through these hours. Sleep continued unless something disturbed it. This pattern repeated each night. Morning would arrive bringing light again. The fire would require attention then. Daily activities would start following patterns. Evening would arrive again after day. The cycle would continue as before. Tasks would be performed as usual. Water would be collected from its source. Food would be prepared following methods. Work would occur in familiar ways. Routines would continue without change. Patterns persisted through passing time. Methods used stayed the same. Skills moved between generations. Knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Stability remained across the years. Seasons moved through their cycles. Weather changed with the seasons. Temperatures rose and fell predictably. Conditions shifted in expected ways. The underlying patterns stayed constant. Households operated through similar routines. Differences between families were minor. The basic structure was shared. Communities functioned on this repetition. Predictability organized collective life. Years accumulated one after another. Generations succeeded the previous ones. Methods transferred to new people. Patterns continued through this succession. Changes were minimal and gradual. Evenings came each day regularly. Darkness followed the daylight always. Fire provided light in the dwellings. Sleep arrived with the night. Mornings renewed the cycle again. The cycle had existed previously. It continued into the future. No endpoint was visible. The pattern was deeply established. Its persistence was complete. Work occurred in familiar forms. Tools served their intended functions. Materials were processed using techniques. Items received maintenance and care. Functions continued uninterrupted. Life followed predictable progressions. Days moved in sequence. Seasons cycled through years. Years added to previous years. The pattern endured. Dwellings fulfilled their purposes. Fires burned in the hearths. Meals were prepared daily. Sleep occurred in designated spaces. Functions remained unchanged. People carried out expected tasks. Skills were applied to work. Knowledge informed the actions. Experience guided the decisions. Routine structured existence. Time advanced continuously forward. Moments accumulated into hours. Hours became days. Days formed seasons. Seasons created years. The pattern continued steadily. Days resembled other days. Evenings followed the same structure. Nights brought equivalent rest. Repetition was constant. Activities occupied daylight time. Evening brought indoor work. Night brought sleep. Morning brought renewal. The cycle had no ending. Days were similar to previous days. Variations were small adjustments. The core pattern remained. Routines persisted. Continuity was maintained. Evening became night. Night became morning. Morning became day. Day became evening. The sequence repeated. Fire was central. Light came from flames. Warmth from burning. Heat for cooking. Fire was necessary. Darkness defined night. Light was absent. Interior had firelight. Movement was limited. Sleep was primary. Routine structured time. Tasks filled hours. Work occupied people. Rest followed work. Pattern organized life. Evening came as light faded from the sky. People moved toward their dwellings from work areas. The paths were familiar from daily use. Navigation was automatic and required no thought. Homes were reached as darkness gathered outside. Doors closed after people entered the interior. The closing separated inside from outside completely. Warmth had accumulated from fire burning during day. Smoke remained in upper portions of the room. The environment was familiar from previous evenings. Fire received attention for evening use. Wood was added to flames already burning. The hearth location was permanent in the dwelling. Ash beneath showed continuous use over time. Heat radiated outward from the burning wood. Food was accessed from storage for the meal. Grains provided the base of the meal. Additional items were included when available. Meals resembled those made on previous evenings. Methods were the same as before. Vessels were arranged to receive fire's heat. Heat transferred through proximity to flames. Food warmed as the fire burned steadily. Stirring happened at intervals during cooking. The cooking continued as other work occurred. Food was distributed when cooking concluded. Portions were allocated according to household patterns. Eating took place near the fire's light. The meal proceeded in usual manner. Vessels were gathered for cleaning afterward. Cleaning used water that might be warmed. Residue was removed from vessel surfaces. Vessels returned to their storage locations. The places for storage did not change. Organization was maintained through consistency. Work for evening began after eating. Women worked on textile production indoors. Spinning created thread from prepared fibers. The motion was repetitive and continued. Thread collected on spindles gradually. Spinning needed little light to perform. Practiced movements guided the process. Completed thread was wound for storage. Work continued throughout the year. Techniques remained as they had been. Clothing repairs occupied evening time. Items were examined for repair needs. Tiers were closed with needle and thread. Worn sections received additional stitching. Repairs allowed continued use of garments. Men performed tool maintenance during evening. Parts were checked for problems. Fittings were tightened to secure them. Metal parts were readied for sharpening. Tools remained functional through maintenance. Sharpening used stones kept for purpose. Tool edges moved across stone surfaces. Practice technique controlled the motion. Work continued until edges were sharp. Regular sharpening kept tools effective. Leather items received repair when needed. Stitching was replaced where it had failed. Sections were reinforced or patched. Repair methods were learned skills. Items lasted longer with proper care. Baskets with damage were examined. Broken weaving could be redone. Repair matched original construction patterns. Repaired baskets returned to service. Knowledge of repair was widespread. Preparing for morning happened during evening. Items needed were positioned nearby. Clothing for next day was selected. Tools for work were checked. Preparations made morning simpler. Wood for morning fire was placed near hearth. Dry wood made starting fire easier. Placement allowed reaching it in darkness. Adequate supply prevented delays. Morning fire was essential. Water brought inside eliminated morning trips outside. Water was stored in suitable containers. It remained available through the night. Containers prevented water from spilling. This practice was standard. Children did work matching their abilities. Younger children handled simpler tasks. Older children took more complex work. Learning occurred through doing tasks. Skills improved slowly over time. Conversation among household members occurred. Talk addressed practical daily matters. Discussion happened when coordination was needed. Silence was common during work. Extended conversation was not typical. Fire needed wood added periodically. Wood was placed at regular intervals. Amount added was judged by experience. Maintaining fire required learned skill. Balance served multiple purposes. Smoke from fire rose toward openings. Roof openings were designed for this. Some smoke stayed in upper space. Smoke smell was absorbed by everything. Constant presence was normal. Outside was dark without light sources. Some nights had moonlight. Overcast nights had complete darkness. Moving outside was difficult. Most people remained indoors. Outside sounds carried to interior. Animals created noises in darkness. Wind made sounds around structures. Rain created patterns when falling. Sounds were familiar. Inside sounds came from fire and people. Burning wood made crackling sounds. People moving created small noises. Occasional talking added to sounds. Overall sound level stayed low. Interior temperature decreased with night. Fire warmed only nearby areas. Spaces away stayed cool. People positioned near fire. Additional coverings provided warmth. Evening work wound down near sleeping time. Tasks were put aside temporarily. Materials went to storage. Fire was adjusted for overnight. Preparations for sleeping began. Sleeping areas were arranged with bedding. Straw cushioned the sleeping surface. Fabric coverings added warmth. Same locations were used nightly. Arrangement was routine. Clothing for sleeping depended on temperature. Some garments were removed. Other layers stayed on. Decision balanced comfort and temperature. Practices were consistent. Fire burned down as evening ended. Darkness in room increased. Movement became more cautious. Visual details became impossible. Declining fire marked sleep approaching. Sleep began when people settled. No particular time marked start. Tiredness brought sleep naturally. Fire continued at low level. Quiet replaced earlier activity. Night hours passed with little happening. Fire consumed fuel slowly. Outside remained dark. Sleep continued unless disturbed. Pattern repeated each night. Morning would arrive with light. Fire would require attention. Activities would start following patterns. Evening would arrive again. Cycle would continue. Tasks would be performed. Water would be collected. Food would be prepared. Work would occur. Routines would continue. Patterns persisted through time. Methods stayed the same. Skills moved between generations. Knowledge was preserved. Stability remained. Seasons moved through cycles. Weather changed with seasons. Temperatures shifted predictably. Conditions altered in expected ways. Underlying patterns stayed constant. Households operated through routines. Differences between families were minor. Basic structure was shared. Communities functioned on repetition. Predictability organized life. Years accumulated one after another. Generations succeeded previous ones. Methods transferred to new people. Patterns continued through succession. Changes were minimal. Evenings came each day. Darkness followed daylight. Fire provided light. Sleep arrived with night. Morning's renewed cycle. The cycle had existed before. It continued into future. No endpoint was visible. Pattern was established. Persistence was complete. Work occurred in familiar forms. Tools served intended functions. Materials were processed. Items received maintenance. Functions continued. Life followed predictable progressions. Days moved in sequence. Seasons cycled through years. Years added to previous years. Pattern endured. Dwellings fulfilled their purposes. Fires burned in hearths. Meals were prepared. Sleep occurred in spaces. Functions remained unchanged. People carried out expected tasks. Skills were applied. Knowledge informed actions. Experience guided decisions. Routine structured existence. Time advanced continuously. Moments accumulated into hours. Hours became days. Days formed seasons. Seasons created years. Pattern continued steadily. Days resembled other days. Evenings followed same structure. Nights brought equivalent rest. Repetition was constant. Activities occupied daylight. Evening brought indoor work. Night brought sleep. Morning brought renewal. Cycle had no ending. Days were similar. Variations were small. Core pattern remained. Routines persisted. Continuity was maintained. Evening became night. Night became morning. Morning became day. Day became evening. Sequence repeated endlessly. Fire was central to evening. Light came from flames. Warmth from burning. Heat for cooking. Fire was necessary for life. Darkness defined nighttime. Light was absent outside. Interior had firelight only. Movement was limited. Sleep was primary activity. Routine structured time. Tasks filled hours. Work occupied people. Rest followed work. Pattern organized life completely. Households functioned through repetition. Evenings were similar. Nights followed pattern. Mornings began anew. Consistency was complete throughout. Generations lived similarly. Older people remembered similar evenings. Younger people experienced same patterns. Children learned routines through observation. Continuity spanned lifetimes without interruption. Knowledge was practical and applied. Skills were functional and used. Methods were effective and proven. Techniques were established and reliable. Application was consistent across time. Materials served their purposes. Wood burned for fire. Grain provided food. Fiber became thread. Clay formed vessels for use. Tools enabled work to continue. Maintenance kept them functional. Sharpening restored their edges. Repairs extended their life. Use was continuous and ongoing. Clothing provided necessary coverage. Repairs maintained their usefulness. Fibers were spun into thread. Thread was woven into cloth. Garments were made from cloth. Storage preserved essential resources. Grain was kept dry. Water was contained properly. Materials were organized efficiently. Access was maintained through order. Spaces served their functions. Hearths contained the fire. Storage held the supplies. Areas provided rest. Organization remained consistent. Time was unmarked by measurements. Daylight indicated activity time. Darkness indicated rest time. Seasons indicated cycles. Patterns provided order to life. No measurements existed for time. Sun position showed progression. Light levels showed change. Natural cycles guided activities. Rhythm was organic and natural. Days blended into each other. Individual days were unremarkable. Patterns spanned multiple days. Weeks had no markers. Time flowed continuously forward. Seasons brought expected changes. Planting times came predictably. Growing periods passed as expected. Harvest times arrived on schedule. Cycles repeated without variation. Years were not counted or marked. Time was experienced directly. Past merged with present seamlessly. Future would resemble past closely. Continuity was seamless and unbroken. Life continued in established patterns. Work was performed as needed. Rest was taken when appropriate. Needs were met through routine. Existence persisted through repetition. Fire burned each evening as before. Light was provided by flames. Warmth was given to inhabitants. Food was cooked over heat. Activity centered around the fire. Darkness came with each nightfall. Outside became completely black. Inside glowed from firelight. Movement slowed with darkness. Rest approached as light faded. Sleep came naturally to people. Bodies were tired from work. Minds quieted in darkness. Fire burned low through night. Rest occurred in sleeping areas. Morning would arrive again. Light would return predictably. Fire would be built anew. Work would begin again. Pattern would repeat itself. The cycle had no clear beginning. The cycle had no definite end. The pattern simply existed continuously. It continued always without stopping. Time moved within the pattern. Each evening was like others before. Each night brought similar rest. Each morning started in same way. Each day followed established patterns. Consistency was total and complete.